And I'll perhaps just start by saying, first of all, saying hi to the new colleagues, to the colleagues who've just arrived, and again, apologizing for not being with you physically. I, unfortunately, for personal reasons, have been unable to travel to Italy this week, but I have very much enjoyed the experience of interacting with you all through technology. I have learned a lot. And I have also very much enjoyed, can I say, the tutorial sessions with the associates yesterday. I had a fairly intense day yesterday, and some very, very interesting discussions and some very interesting and innovative projects out there, which I am delighted to learn about. And can I also say, although it is not perhaps the ideal way to do it, that I am delighted to have the opportunity and hope to have further opportunity next week to interact with the TETRA project and the framework for competence of literary translators. You may be aware that we are hoping to produce a special issue of ITT around the ePetra project. So I'm very, very much looking forward to reading the papers in that special issue, in what is a slightly different framework, but one which I don't think is incompatible with the one I presented on Monday. Today, I want to move on a little bit to an issue which is not initially directly linked to pedagogies and to education, but which I am going to link into pedagogies and education towards the end of the lecture. And that is the issue of directionality. Directionality in translation. And I'm just going to share the screen now so that you can have the presentation. Okay. Let's see. This is working.
Yep, we see it.
You can see it.
Yep. Can you see yourself still?
That's what I'm trying. I can see myself and I have my slides. So
Sure.
yeah.
Great.
Okay, this is great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about directionality in translation, directionality in professional practice, and directionality in translator education, as I said, towards the end of the lecture. But in order to do that, I'm going to start in translation studies literature and have a look at how the myth of the native translator is present in translation studies literature. I want to have a very quick look at the concept of mother tongue in the professional context, a look at directionality in the professional market, a quick look at directionality in the translation process, and end up back in translator education, which is the theme which brings us together this week. If we have a look, just a quick look at some quotes on directionality, maybe I should start with a few words about what I mean by directionality, because it's perhaps not entirely clear to everyone. Directionality is the direction in which, or the concepts around the direction in which translators translate, whether they translate from what is normally called their mother tongue into an acquired language, whether they translate from an acquired language into their mother tongue. I'm going to problematize a little bit the issue of mother tongue. Whether they translate between two acquired languages, and so on. Now, I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Michael, I don't know, are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, we hear you fine. You're hearing buzzing?
Okay, I can hear a bit of background noise, but that's okay. I can cope with the background noise. If you can hear me, that's fine.
Let me try, hang on. Let me just see if I can make it better for you. Just a second. That probably just got louder, did it?
It got louder.
Yep.
But yeah, okay.
Just a second. Let's try. The problem is.
I think I'm actually hearing myself as well. I'm hearing the echo.
Yeah.
So,
Hang on a second here. Let me see. Bear with me.
Yeah.
Any better?
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so one first quote on directionality in translation literature. Very, very clear. Le thème n'existe pas. Okay, so thème and version being, of course, the traditional French distinction between translation into the mother tongue, version, and translation into foreign language, thème. Quite clearly, L'Admiral simply does not believe that thème is a form of professional translation. I'm going to take the headphones off. Is that okay? Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. The second quote that I'm bringing you about directionality in translation is from Peter Newmark. And he actually makes explicit a given and implicit assumption in much translation studies literature by saying, I shall assume that you, reader, are learning to translate into your language of habitual use. Now, I'll perhaps come back to that term a little bit later on, since that is the only way you can translate naturally, accurately, and with maximum effectiveness. In fact, however, most translators do translate out of their own language. Service translation, he calls it, and contribute greatly to many people's hilarity in the process. Okay, so this is the association between poor quality translation and translating into the non-mother tongue. It is assumed that the problems in the translation come from the directionality and not necessarily from other aspects, such as quite simply not being a professional. A quote now from Spain, Valentin García Yebra, who says that it is practically impossible, except in cases of total bilingualism, which I note he doesn't define, and even then with limitations, that someone can translate from her own language to another with the same perfection, interesting concept also, than from another language into her own. I'm feminizing something which I'm not sure García Yebra would have feminized, but anyway. And then he says, what in Spain is called inverse translation, so translation out of the mother tongue, is much less useful in Spain than translation into the mother tongue. Again, I think a very interesting reflection on the idea of usefulness of translation. And clearly here we have translation as importation, as importing from abroad, whereas in actual fact a great deal of translation is about exporting, about projecting outside the country. And then another quote from another Spanish translation studies specialist, Miguel Ángel Vega, who says that he excludes intentionally translation of texts into the foreign language, a translation which no one should do unless they are perfect bilinguals. Okay, so a lot of concepts and ideas there, which I think have been a given in translation studies in the West, and I think it's important perhaps to underline this, and it's a reflection perhaps of some of the Western-centric or Euro-centric approaches to translation studies, which was largely unquestioned until around the year 2000, the end of the 90s, year 2000, when we started to hear some translation scholars question the myth, at least dispute the myth, and come up with some slightly different approaches. A few examples of these early questioning of the myth. Mary Snell Hornby, in the year 2000, in a publication of the proceedings of a conference held in Ljubljana, in Slovenia, about what was called in the conference title Translation into Non-Mother Tongues. After a fairly long and complicated process of what do we call this form of translation, and I think it's perhaps interesting to see that the very fact that we're not entirely sure what to call translation into a non-mother tongue, into an acquired language, would testify to its rather complicated situation within the discipline. But Mary Snell Hornby recognizes here that translation into English non-mother tongue, and she makes a differentiation here between English and other languages, is a fact of modern life, and future professionals need to be trained for it. Christiane Nord, in a similar vein and without actually mentioning directionality as such, but I think clearly linked to directionality, says it's better to know how to translate without mastering the language perfectly than mastering the language perfectly without knowing how to translate. Around 97, as I said, was this very first event on directionality held in Ljubljana, which then led to publication in the year 2000 of conference proceedings around the subject. In 2003, we held an event here in Granada with participation of some of the specialists who had been present in Ljubljana in 97, and one of them has since become a leading expert in the field of directionality, and that is Professor Nida from Ljubljana, who in her doctoral thesis set out to question and disprove the myth that translating into the mother tongue is always better. And this is just a very quick summary of her findings. And her findings, by the way, are related to literary translation, not to the kind of very practical, operative, pragmatic, whatever we want to call the text types, which are usually associated with translation into non-mother tongue. Her conclusion in her award-winning research is that the quality of the translation, its fluency and acceptability in the target language environment depend primarily on the as yet undetermined individual abilities of the particular translator, his or her translation strategy and knowledge of the source and target cultures, and not on his or her mother tongue or the direction in which he or she is translating. So we move from the hilarity that translation into a non-mother tongue apparently always produces to really the direction of translation is not the essential factor in the quality of the translation, its fluency and its acceptability. And we continue in this vein. Here, a quote from Margaret Rogers from the UK. Where the successful non-native speaker translation may have lacked a degree of naturalness, compared, for instance, to successful native speaker translations, the absence of mistranslations and the acceptable level of comprehensible English suggest that non-native speakers trained in translation may be perfectly competent translators in certain situations, particularly where the purpose of the task is to provide information only. It could reasonably be argued that the present data do not support a global prescription on the use of non-native speakers as professional translators, but rather that their work should be subject to certain conditions. By contrast, fluent but inaccurate translations by native speaker translators can be counterproductive. So again, here insisting on a certain text type, here not talking about literary translation, as Nike Pokorn did in her research, but I think clearly differentiating between two aspects of the translation process: the comprehension of the source text on the one hand, and the production of the target text on the other, and questioning whether we should always give priority to the fluent production of the target text over full and acceptable comprehension of the source text. This is interesting, I think, also in that, again, the issue comes up in special issues of journals throughout the early 2000s. This is a call for papers for a special issue of the Translator, bringing in minority cultures, okay? So both minority cultures and migrant experiences, and I think we started to talk about some of this yesterday, are providing us with texts which bear the mark of translation in their own genetic imprint and question the notion of mother tongue. Ultimately, this call for papers says this is a route which may also lead us to question the continuing reliance of translation studies on models that assume as a norm the movement of a stable monolingual original from the source to the target language, these latter to be understood as two equally fixed poles identified with national languages. So a calling into question, on the whole, of models of translation process. And this, round about the same time, interestingly, also appears in a call for papers for Target. So a call for papers in the Translator, a call for papers in Target. Target, in the call for papers, says implicitly or explicitly translation is still defined. And I think it's interesting, this implicitly, because very often it is not made explicit. Translation is still defined as the full transposition of one monolingual source code into one monolingual target code for the benefit of a monolingual target public. This definition neglects at least two significant factors. First, the fact that by definition discourses are never totally monolingual, and that rather than just reflecting social polyglossia, original and translated discourses select certain heteroglossic elements, each of them having a function in the representation of social polyglossia. Second, the fact that the monolingualism of source and target culture authors, critics, audiences, etc., can be less absolute than conventionally expected, especially in monolingual or so-called global, in multilingual, or in so-called global environments. Just a quick comment here on the concept of mother tongue, and a quick comment on how I would normally address this issue in class with the students, so to link the whole issue into translator education. I believe that a very important part of translator education is awareness raising and promoting reflection amongst our students, amongst future professionals, and amongst future experts in intercultural communication, translation, and related activities. I see I did not take away the Spanish version here. So what I would very often do in the classroom with the students is ask them to define their own language competence, their own language combinations, using the AIC ABC codes, which are the ones that we use in Spain for the definition of course content and so on, and I'll perhaps come back to that a little bit later on. So A as native or quasi-native, and apologies for the remaining Spanish version there. B as active competence for professional use, and C as passive competence for professional use. When students join our programs, they are normally faced with an institutional context in which there is a single A language. In the case of my institution, that is Spanish. In the case of most institutions, it's the national language of the country in which the institution is situated. There are exceptions to this, and I think they are very, very worthy exceptions. Although I'll perhaps come back to question a little bit how they are structured. There are within Spain, which is a multilingual country, whether or not that is to the liking of the current administration. There are universities in bilingual regions of the country which work with 2 A languages. So in Catalonia and in the Valencian region, we have universities working with Catalan and with Spanish as alternative A languages. In the Basque country, we have a university which works with Basque and with Castilian Spanish. And in Galicia, we have a university working with Galician as an A language, as an alternative A language. So we have 2 A languages. In the rest of the country, we work with Spanish as an A language. And most students, when they join a program, most students are local. We discussed this yesterday briefly. And so in the canonical situation, this is not problematic. I'm talking here about the south of Spain, Granada, as a pretty monolingual part of the country. Students then choose a B language which is their major language. In Spain, notice only one, and we discussed this yesterday in one of the tutorials. Only one because of the secondary education system, where we cannot require students to join our university programs with an advanced level in 2 foreign languages, because our secondary education system does not offer that level of foreign language competence. So students will normally choose between major European languages, English, French, German. In the case of Granada, we also have Arabic, and I'll come back to Arabic as a case study, perhaps in a little moment. Arabic is a B language, and then all students take, and this was decreed by the ministry in the early 1990s, and although it is no longer decreed by the ministry, it has become an assumption on all translation programs in Spain. All students take 2 foreign languages, one at a higher level of proficiency, active level of proficiency, the other very often learned from scratch. Now, one of the first things I would ask my students is to define their language combination, their own personal language combination, and have them understand the difference between their own personal language combination and the institutional language combination. And I'll just take a couple of examples here. Admission to our program is extremely selective, extremely competitive. And students need to have very, very, very high grades in their secondary education in order to be able to join the Granada program with English as their major foreign language. So what do a lot of students do? A lot of students say, okay, I can't get into English, I'll go into French, or I'll go into German, or even worse, I'll go into Arabic. And they do fulfill the administrative requirements to do so, because we are not allowed, so I'm taking this as a case study in curricular design, we are not allowed by our regional government, and universities are devolved to regional level in Spain, so we have 17 different approaches to higher education. We are not allowed to do an entrance examination. We have to admit students on the basis of their secondary education results. So a student who has results that are not quite good enough to join the program with English as a B language will always have the temptation to join another B language, even if they do not have much knowledge of that language. And we literally have cases, and I know this is shocking, but we literally have cases of students who have no prior knowledge of their B language, particularly if they choose Arabic, which of course is the easiest way to get admission into the faculty. Now, this is a problem which I believe other systems share, particularly in systems where there is no filter between secondary education and university. And it is perhaps one of the reasons why situating translator education at undergraduate level is a big issue. It's a big problem. And I'd just like to dwell a little bit on the case of Arabic. I said we have students joining us to study Arabic as a B language, essentially of two kinds, maybe three, but essentially two. The first are these students who want to study translating, who are very excited about translating, which is an attractive degree program, but who have no knowledge of Arabic as a language, but it's their only way of joining a translation program. So they register thinking, well, maybe I'll be allowed to transfer to English, maybe I'll be allowed to transfer to French, which they are not then allowed to do. Then we have a group of students who come mostly from North Africa, or who are heritage speakers of Arabic, and I'm going to come back to Arabic in just a moment. Because when we say Arabic, we are actually covering a huge variety of language varieties, of dialects, and so on. And most of the students that we would have studying Arabic B language, whose mother tongue in inverted commas is Arabic, are in fact natives of one of the Moroccan dialects. And their ability in standard Arabic, in Fusa, is actually very, very limited. Their ability in Spanish is also of a very, very, very diverse nature. And then we have a few students who are perhaps the students that we would really be looking for, who have already taken a first undergraduate degree in Arabic, who are Spanish native speakers, and who want to learn to become professional translators. There are very, very few of those, because most of them, rather than taking a full 4-year undergraduate program, prefer to do a much shorter master's program, and we do have a master's program designed for them. Now, you will be asking me, why on earth does your university maintain this offer, this fiction? And I must confess to sharing your perplexity. The reason why my university in the first place decided to offer Arabic as a B language was because of the very long tradition which the University of Granada has in the teaching of Arabic. Our closest foreign neighbor is Morocco. And of course, Granada has a very, very long Arab history until 1492, when the city was the last kingdom, the last part of Spain to fall to the Catholic monarchs. And this was used as a reason, as a motivation, as a justification for including Arabic as a B language. Some of us argued that Arabic would be a very interesting A language for the university to offer, thinking of our heritage speakers and thinking of our Moroccan students who come in considerable numbers to study in Granada. And a good C language, because their students can begin to learn the language from scratch. But that as a B language, it had very little sense whatsoever. But at the time, the authorities decided that B was the right place to put it. And so now for well over 10 years, we have been struggling with this situation. So that was just a brief case study to comment on why language combination and why institutional language combination versus personal language combination can be an issue. It can, of course, be a further issue if we take into account the internationalization of higher education, which we discussed yesterday, and where we can find, for example, in the same classroom, and I'm thinking now of my typical introduction to translation modules, I teach introduction to translation into B. Okay, so what other people call inverse translation, TEM, indirect translation are some of the terms which are used for it. Sometimes in that classroom I will have 10 different mother tongues, 10 different native languages. And when I say that, of course, questioning the whole idea of just what is a mother tongue, questioning the idea that someone is always equally proficient in all domains of their life in their mother tongue. I use myself as an example. I was, of course, born as a native speaker of English in a very monolingual environment, a very deliberately politically monolingual environment, because I was born in Northern Ireland. And I was born in a Protestant family in Northern Ireland. And Ireland is a bilingual country, it's a bilingual island. But the huge divide which exists in Irish society, and which fortunately is slowly progressing to much, much better peaceful cohabitation, meant that at no point was there any question of my learning Irish. At no point. The separation in the education system and so on is such that I was in, and I think this is linked, of course, to power. It's linked to the role of the nation states and so on. But this was very, very deliberate, that one part of the community in Northern Ireland should never speak or come into contact with the language of the island, the Irish language, something I regret tremendously personally. But as I said, in a very, very monolingual environment, but then enjoyed languages a great deal and went into translator training. When I joined my translator training program, I very clearly had one A language and two B languages. Two B languages at an early stage. So I had a fairly proficient level of French and Spanish, but not what would be a fully professional B level in the use of those two languages. I also had passive competence in German. And I will tell the students my life story and encourage them to look at their own language patterns. And I will encourage them to think about their own language level in different languages at different times. And I will point out to them that competence in a language is also linked to the way in which you live that language and the experiences which, of course, you have in that language. Through my own experience, where I would consider that at this point in time, my Spanish is probably more my A language, and I come back to Peter Newmark's language of habitual use, than English, although I use English a great deal professionally. There are domains of my life which I have never lived in English. And I think that is something that it is very, very interesting for them to reflect on also. And I use examples from their own experience, such as when they've been living abroad for a while. About 80% of the students on our program spend at least 6 months abroad during the program. So many of the students I will have in the class are returning students. They're returning from a mobility period abroad. And many of them return with interference from the language of their country, of mobility country, their host country. They will return with interference in their Spanish. And so we also use that to question the whole issue of native competence versus professional competence, and so on. Okay, a fairly long digression there. I'll come back now to the slides, but just to understand the impact of these very, very deeply rooted givens on institutional structures, curricular structures, and on what individual students then experience on their degree programs. A student who does not have the A language of the institution as their A language is probably at a fairly considerable disadvantage, given the way programs are structured, given the way assessment is carried out, and so on. So again, coming back to our trainer training, there is a fairly strong need, I believe, for trainers to become more aware of all of these issues and take them into account in their curricular and syllabus design. Part of the needs analysis of prior to actual curricular design. This is simply a quote from Erich Punsch. Basically, I'm not going to read through it or translate it into English right now, but you will have it. Basically questioning the whole idea of a single mother tongue right the way through a person's life, and how the ability and the competence in the mother tongue goes up and down, varies at different points in a person's life. Okay, another quote from Tellin on the concept of mother tongue, where he says the notion of native speaker and the mother tongue principle are no longer valid for these times. And he links this to technology, the availability of a range of translation tools and changing translation requirements seem to support the claim that native speakers of the target language are no longer the sole professional option. In addition, the concept of native speaker and the mother tongue principle cannot be precisely characterized, such that translating into English as one's mother tongue can be clearly set apart from translating into English as a non-native language. And one further issue, I think, which is interesting in relation to English as a lingua franca with regard to directionality, is that the use of global English, English as a lingua franca, or as Lance Hewson from Geneva would have it, bad English, means that very, very often the source texts that translators are working with have not been written by native speakers. So this, of course, would again call into question the model, the idea. The source text is produced in an ideal monolingual context by an ideal monolingual writer with native competence to be translated into a monolingual version in a target language, and so on. A very good example, but certainly not the only example, would be the huge number of texts which are produced in the European Union. The European Union being the largest employer of translators in the world. The huge number of source texts which are now not produced by native speakers of English, much to the chagrin of many of the English language translators in the European Union. The quality of the original texts in English is very often questionable, so one wonders why on earth in the translation profession we would exclude professional translators translating into their language, which they master much better than those producing source texts in English. But the whole idea of mother tongue, native speakers, is not only present in translation studies literature, it is also very, very present in the professional literature. And here just a couple of examples. We have the ITI Code of Conduct, which says a member shall translate only into a language in which he, Sikh, has mother tongue or equivalent competence. And this is an ad from Language International, an ad by a large translation company where potential customers are told your translations are carried out by native translators living and working in their own countries. And I think this is very interesting. With the slogan, native translation works better. Okay, why do I think this quote is particularly interesting? I think it's interesting firstly because it recognizes the risk of attrition. It recognizes the risk of language attrition. So it's not just a case of being a native, according to this ad, but being a native living in a context where the language is spoken. But clearly, very, very, very centered on producing good, natural, fluent target text, rather than ensuring good, full comprehension of the source text. And this is something which translation studies tends to do a great deal. It perhaps does it even more in recent times, where functionalist approaches have perhaps led, and I would declare myself to be a functionalist in translation, but led many, many people to think only of the target text and to give much less importance to the understanding of the source text. So I think here we see a whole series of tensions coming into play. And these are tensions which, of course, the students have to deal with. Now, however much Beverly Adab in the early 2000s said, the view that translators should work into the mother tongue is a meme which is fast becoming unenforceable and impractical in this era of globalized communications and intercultural exchanges. I still continue to find that our students and our recent graduates, and I think the tracing of recent graduates and what they are living through when they join the professional market is very, very important here. They are still constantly coming up against the belief in the profession that translation should be carried out into the mother tongue. And yet, the constant tension, because if we look, and again my example is from Spain, if we look at the Spanish translation market, depending on the text type, between 30 and 40% of translations are carried out from Spanish into other languages, approximately, especially, English. So recent graduates are coming into a market which on the one hand is asking them to translate into English, into their B language, and at the same time is telling them that you really shouldn't do this. So we're causing attention for recent graduates. I wanted to have a brief look at directionality in the translation process. Perhaps just quickly, this is a description of the translation process by the British Standards Association, Professional Standards Association, together with the Institute of Linguists. And I think it's an interesting description of the translation process, and one which might perhaps allow us to look at where directionality comes into the translation process, where it really has an impact. If we look step by step, the first step is to agree the purpose and scope of the translation service. So we're identifying the purpose, function, and status of the translation. There, the language combination of the translator does not directly have an impact. Agree the language demands of the translation. Again, the translator can agree the language demands, whatever their language combination. Agree a plan for producing the translation. Now here, in that plan, the translator will need to think about what resources they need and whether the direction of the translation has an impact on the resources which they need. And then they will need to look at what resources there are available, how they obtain them, how they allocate them, and so on. Clearly, here, the translator will need slightly different resources depending on their degree of competence in the source language, in the target language, and in the subject matter of the translation. So there is an impact there. The second part of the process in this model, this is only one model, there are lots of others, identify the language requirements of the translation. And I think this is particularly interesting from the perspective of directionality. The first point is to assess and agree the language level and frame of reference of the user of the translation. So, language level and frame of reference of the user. So who's going to read the translation? If the user, does the user of the translation actually need a fully publishable translation? And this again is something which Erich Brunsch has spoken a great deal about, has written a great deal about. And that is the assumption which is made certainly in most translator education programs, but also in translation studies, that we should always be aiming at the best possible translation, perfection. We saw in those early quotes how the idea of perfection comes up. Whereas in actual fact, in communication and in day-to-day communication, perfection, quality are concepts which are at best relative, and of course will depend on the purpose, origins, and context of the original text, but also of the source text. And here Erich Brunschen, and just to conclude on this particular slide, Erich Brunsch introduces a concept which I think is particularly interesting, and that is the concept of suboptimality. So not all professional translation actually needs to be perfect in terms of the model of the perfect monolingual source context, the perfect monolingual target context. And depending on what use is going to be made of the translation, who's going to be reading it, for what purpose, very often, in fact, what would be understood to be suboptimal is actually a better solution. And I'm just going to give one example of that because I know it sounds a little bit strange. But an example from the world of research, and an example which perhaps many of you have come up with in your life, in your day-to-day life as researchers, and certainly when you speak to colleagues researching in other fields. Many of my Spanish colleagues will attend international conferences, and they have a fairly good level of English. But when they come back, they will say to me, okay, you know, my presentation went well, everyone understood me, that was fine, and it was really good for me. I was able to listen to all the other researchers speaking at the conference. And you know, my English is okay, I managed to understand them all, except a couple. And you know who those couple are? They're the native speakers of English. So the perfect monolingual presentation is in fact not working in our international communication. So I think the whole idea of allowing our students to critique, question, and reflect on different communicative situations and to question this notion of perfect bilinguals and so on and so forth is also something that is well worthwhile in the educational context. Which is not to say, and I think it's important perhaps to emphasize this, that we are simply saying anything goes. Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. There are standards to be met. And one of the, I think, very, very interesting things when discussing directionality with students is precisely to encourage them to be very self-critical and to encourage them to be very analytical of their own ability to undertake specific translation commissions. And in fact, exercises in, here is a translation commission into your mother tongue, here is a translation commission into a foreign language. Can you decide whether you should or not accept this translation commission as a professional? If so, why, and what resources do you need and how do you do it? If not, why not? And also on helping them to understand that although there are a lot of pressures out there, they are decision makers and they can decide to accept or not accept translation briefs due to issues of directionality, but also due to all sorts of other issues, which I won't go into today, but which I think are very, very important in the education of I said, reflective and critical professionals. I'm not going to go through the whole idea of translator competence, because I want to get on to the final part of the talk. Just very briefly also, however, to remind students and to remind customers and to remind employers, to remind anyone involved in professional translation, that the European standard would imply that all professional translation should be revised, and that revision as part of the teamwork in producing a translation is also important when we're speaking about directionality, and that revision has a slightly different role when the translation is working into A, when the translator is working to B, and professional revisers need to be aware of that different role when they're working with a native translator and non-native translator, when they're working with a translator who's an expert in the subject matter or who is not an expert in the subject matter. Much in the same way as, of course, they need to know that post-editing machine-produced translation is not the same as revising human translation. And then, as I said, just maybe 5 minutes to come back to some of the major issues in directionality in translator education. The first is that very often when we read what our colleagues say, or when we read the rationales behind translator programs and curricular designs around the world, we will see that the presence of translation into B is very often linked to improving language level. So colleagues will say, yes, it's good for students to do translation into B while they're at the university. They should never do it professionally, but if they do some translating into B at the university, they improve their language. So clearly, a result of the grammar translation approach to language learning and so on, and very much in the French tradition of thème and version for language learning, not for training as professional translators. I would situate myself very, very clearly in the other paradigm. That is, I believe that translation into B is an end. It is part of a professional translator's competence. Whether or not the translator then decides professionally to use it or not is an individual decision, and I think it's very, very important that we should insist to our students that individually they will then choose their path. Maybe they all have to study legal translation while they're at the university, but once they become professionals, they may never do a single professional legal translation in their lives. And similarly with their language combination. And similarly, as recent graduates, they may feel that they do not want to translate into their B, but 5 years on, after a prolonged stay in a country where they've been using the language a great deal, they may feel quite comfortable in doing so, or quite the opposite. They may feel that attrition has set in and they are not up to translating. So there is nothing static about language combination. Another of the reasons why programs will often say that they are introducing translation both B, A, C, A, and A, B is because they are complementary, in that if students translate only into A, they become very, very set in their ways and in their resources and in the way in which they translate. It is very, very interesting to see that students translating into B use documentary resources in different ways. They use more documentary resources because they are less confident. And so in actual fact, they very often make fewer mistakes than people working into A, because people working into A don't check the use of their mother tongue. They believe that they can use their mother tongue quite happily, and very often ignore the difficulty of writing specialized language, which they're not familiar with in their mother tongue, and so on and so forth. So the complementarity of working in the two directions helps them to understand the essence of the process, and also helps them to understand the need for resources and the different use of resources. But I think that today, having said all of this in the very sort of classical situation where the students all have the same A language, and share also the B language and share the language combination, is to come back a little bit to what we discussed yesterday, whereby very, very often the institutional language combination is not the individual student's language combination. We have a huge diversity in the classroom, and we as teachers, trainers, and as curricular designers need to take this on board. And in fact, today, I think I would seriously question the traditional structure of most translator trainer programs, where there is a whole series of subjects which are taught repeatedly through the curriculum in different language directions. So we have legal translation BA, legal translation AB. And the BAAB is an institutional combination. It is not the individual combination of each student. And I personally think that there would be a great deal to be said, and there is a great deal to be said, for bringing those together and simply saying, okay, we're working in legal translation, and actually getting down to the essence of the translation, because very often the language combination itself moves the class into a comparative linguistics mode, which doesn't necessarily take on board the real translation problems that we need to be dealing with. And this is something which is occurring increasingly on master's programs in countries which are very, very attractive to international students. So for example, in the UK, we will have master's programs where students will be coming from 50, 20 different countries, and the core program is the same for everyone. And there are varying responses to how to deal then with individual language combinations, but there is not, shall we say, an institutional language combination. And I think this is something which curricular designers are having to deal with increasingly, and I think it offers a great deal of opportunity to curricular designers to do much more innovative design and to really offer quality education to some of our students who are perhaps on the margins of the traditional situation. There are, and we have been working here in Granada for some time, some colleagues and myself, many very, very interesting, motivating ways of involving students with different language combinations, different mother tongues, different foreign languages in the classroom, in simulated translation projects, even in authentic translation projects. We were discussing some of this yesterday, where they take on different roles and where their personal language combination can have an impact on the role that they play in each translation project. Also encouraging internationalization of the classroom in what should be a very, very international discipline, but which very often, in the more traditional training situations, has quite some difficulty in dealing with internationalization and dealing with the diverse, multilingual, multinational classroom, which I think is a big paradox of our discipline and one that we should address. Okay, and I think with that, I have gone over my time. I'm sorry. I think we started a bit late, but I think I have even made us a little bit later. So apologies for that. And over to you.
All right.
Over to you.
Thank you, Dorothy. And
take away the shared screen so that we can talk.
okay. We do still thank you, Dorothy, for that third lecture, and turn to you for comments, questions,